What happens between two consulting adults in the privacy of...
It's fantastic!
Remember those funny TV show spin-offs? The ones you loved but somehow totally forgot? Back then, spin-offs filled the gaps between weeknights and weekends, bringing familiar faces and weird new stories into our living rooms. But if they made us laugh so much, why don't we talk about them anymore? You know a television show is doing well when the side characters get their own show? And that is exactly what happened with the Ropers. Stanley and Helen Roper were the kind of couple that somehow always argued but still managed to feel like they had a system going. Three's Company was no stranger to chaos, but the Ropers were in a league of their own. Stanley was cheap, Helen was desperate for attention, and together they created some of the show's funniest tension. But then, someone somewhere decided, what if we take this mess and make a whole new mess out of it? That is how The Ropers was born, a sitcom that aired in the late 1970s and decided to explore what would happen if this bickering pair left the comfort of their old apartment building and moved into a new upscale community. Sounds like trouble, right? It was. And not the kind of trouble that keeps people glued to their televisions. More like the kind where you forget the show existed 2 weeks later. The setup was promising. The Ropers leave their familiar world and try to fit in among upper-middle-class neighbors who are nothing like them. Stanley, of course, is still cheap and clueless, while Helen is still yearning for romance and relevance. But in this new environment, their antics just did not land the same way. There were no Jack Tripper hijinks, no Janet and Chrissy chaos, and no beachside landlords to blame everything on. It was just the Ropers, loud, awkward, and painfully out of place. The biggest problem? They took side dish energy and tried to make it the main course. You ever go to a restaurant and ask for just a plate of pickles and fries? Sure, they taste good when they are sitting next to the steak, but try making a full meal out of them, and you are going to be disappointed. That is what the Ropers felt like. It was trying to stretch every joke they ever made on Three's Company into an entire series, and after a while, it started to feel more like a rerun of itself than anything new. What made it even worse was the timing. The show took the Ropers away from Three's Company right when the original show was hitting its peak. And guess what? Their replacements on the main show were actually pretty funny. So now you had the Ropers on one show being awkward, and the original show doing just fine without them. That is like switching lanes in traffic just to watch the car behind you speed past. Ratings started out decent but dropped fast. The network hoped for gold and got maybe bronze on a good day. Critics did not hold back. One even said the Ropers worked best when they were in small doses, like hot sauce or weird uncles at family dinners. Too much, and you were just left with a headache. After a couple of seasons, the Ropers got quietly canceled. Not a lot of fanfare. No big goodbye special, just a slow fade into sitcom history. What is wild is that Norman Fell, the actor who played Stanley, had turned down other roles to take a shot at making the spin-off work. And that makes it kind of bittersweet. The Ropers might have been funny in their own strange way, but sometimes chemistry only works in the original test tube. You ever have a friend who starts dating someone and it is cute at first, but then they become unbearable together? That is what Joanie Loves Chachi was like. It was a romantic comedy spin-off from Happy Days, which is already a sentence that should make you raise your eyebrows. This was not just a spin-off. It was a bold attempt to turn teen romance into a full-on musical sitcom. And spoiler alert, it flopped harder than a greased-up Fonzie trying to jump a shark. Now, on Happy Days, Joanie Cunningham and Chachi Arcola were that sweet, awkward couple that everyone rooted for. She was the all-American girl, and he was the charming bad boy with just enough swagger to keep things interesting. So when they got their own show, you'd think people would be thrilled. But here's where things got weird, because instead of just being a cute teen couple in Milwaukee, Joanie and Chachi moved to Chicago to start a rock band. Yes, a rock band. The show leaned into musical numbers like it was auditioning for Broadway. Each episode had Chachi, played by Scott Baio, crooning his heart out while Joanie stood nearby looking supportive. Sometimes she sang too. And while the songs were not terrible, The idea that this couple would somehow rise to stardom through lounge gigs and awkward family dinners was ambitious. Too ambitious. And do not get me wrong. The show tried. It really tried. It brought in Chachi's Italian uncle and gave the pair a tight-knit family restaurant to hang out in. It threw in clunky jokes, classic misunderstandings, and as many corny love glances as a network could fit into 22 minutes. But the whole thing just felt off. It had none of the warmth or humor that made Happy Days work. And even though both Joanie and Chachi were fan favorites, putting them front and center revealed that maybe, just maybe, they were better as a subplot. The ratings started strong. That is because everyone wanted to see where Joanie and Chachi ended up. But as soon as the novelty wore off, so did the audience. Turns out, people liked their teen romance on the side, not smothered across an entire series like bad marinara on a frozen pizza. The network tried to salvage it, changed time slots, adjusted scripts, but it was clear the magic was gone. After just 2 seasons, the show got the boot. And to make things even more awkward, the characters went right back to Happy Days like nothing ever happened. It was like watching a couple break up and then pretend they never left the party in the first place. The most iconic part of this spin-off might just be the rumor that it was a massive hit in Korea, supposedly because the name Chachi sounded like something totally different over there. That is probably not true, but honestly, it is still the funniest thing to come out of the whole show. In the end, Joanie Loves Chachi was proof that even beloved characters can fall flat when taken out of their original world. Sometimes a love story needs friends, a jukebox, and a leather-jacketed guy saying "I" in the background to really shine. You know that one friend who tells it like it is, even when no one asked? That was Flo, the red-haired firecracker from Alice who always had a wisecrack ready and a "kiss my grits" locked and loaded. On the original show, she was the comic relief, the perfect foil to Alice's calm, cool, and collected energy. She worked at Mel's Diner and brought the kind of chaotic charm that made you want to pull up a stool and just watch her go, so when Flo got her own show, people were excited. This was not just a random side character getting the spotlight. Flo had presence. She was loud, funny, and knew how to shut down a man with one raised eyebrow. The pitch was simple. Take Flo out of the diner, give her her own business, and let her run wild. It sounded good on paper. But here's the thing about loud personalities. They work best when they are bouncing off someone else. In Flo, the character quits her job at Mel's and moves back home to Texas. And that is where the trouble starts. Instead of her sassy confidence playing off a cast of opposites like it did in Alice, Flo was now surrounded by a bunch of characters just like her. Big, brash, and southern to the core. What you ended up with was a lot of yelling and not a whole lot of balance. The show tried to give her some structure. Flo buys a rundown roadhouse and decides to fix it up. Every episode, she deals with quirky locals, annoying family members, and stubborn contractors. There is a whole lot of small-town problems with big hair solutions energy. And yes, there were laughs, but not the kind that stick. More like the kind where you exhale through your nose and then forget what you were watching. The original magic of Flo was how unpredictable she was. You never quite knew what she was going to say next, and that made her the wild card of Alice. But when the entire show is about her, that unpredictability becomes expected. Every episode had her tossing out catchphrases like party favors and getting into spats with the townsfolk. It was like watching the same scene over and over, just with different wallpaper. Still, Flo did not totally flop. It actually had solid ratings for a while and even beat out some heavy hitters in its time slot. But critics were not impressed. Some said it lacked direction. Others said it was just too loud for its own good. And honestly, they had a point. Flo without Alice was like a jalapeno without the nachos. Strong, spicy, but a little hard to handle on its own. Eventually, the network lost interest. The writing was not evolving, and viewers started tuning out. The show was canceled after 2 seasons, and Flo quietly rode off into the sitcom sunset. Back to reruns and diner nostalgia, where she probably should have stayed in the first place. Looking back, Flo was a reminder that sometimes the supporting act is just that, support. She was hilarious in Alice because she stood out. But when everyone's shouting, no one's really heard. Okay, now this one is where things get real weird, real fast. Out of the Blue was a spin-off, or maybe more like a side spin-off, connected to Happy Days. Except instead of teenage crushes or 1950s diners, this one featured an angel. A literal, winged from heaven, robe-wearing angel named Random. Yes, that was his name. Random. So how do you go from Fonzie and jukeboxes to celestial beings and miracle magic? That is the million-dollar question. The connection was that Random, the angel, makes an appearance on one episode of Happy Days, but that episode aired after Out of the Blue had already premiered. So technically it was a Happy Days spin-off, but only in the same way that adding ketchup to spaghetti makes it Italian. It does not quite fit, and it leaves a strange taste in your mouth. The plot? Random is sent to Earth to help a struggling family and earn his wings. He lives with a woman named Paula and her young nephew, who has the kind of sitcom mischief energy you only see in 1970s child actors. Random has magical powers, but of course he is not supposed to use them. So naturally he uses them. A lot. The whole show was a mix of sentimental life lessons and goofy supernatural gags. 1 minute, Random is fixing a leaky faucet with a snap of his fingers. The next, he is teaching the kid about honesty, courage, or whatever moral they could squeeze into 22 minutes. Think Touched by an Angel meets Who's the Boss, but somehow goofier and with more smoke machine effects. Here's the thing. It was too weird for fans of Happy Days, and not weird enough to be its own thing. It never found its audience. People who tuned in for that wholesome 1950s energy got a glowing man flying around the living room, and fans of fantasy sitcoms already had Mork and Mindy, which, surprise, was also a spin-off from Happy Days. But at least Mork and Mindy leaned into its absurdity and had Robin Williams. Out of the Blue tried to be magical and grounded at the same time. That is a tough ask. Random, played by Jimmy Brogan, was charming enough. He had that warm, dorky uncle vibe, but it was not enough to carry the show. The rest of the cast felt like they were reading from cue cards that someone kept rewriting mid-scene. The special effects were what you would expect from a low-budget network show. Lots of sparkles, smoke puffs, and obvious green screen moments. If you squinted hard enough, it almost worked. But only almost. It lasted just a handful of episodes, not even a full season. The show disappeared so fast, you would think it literally vanished into thin air. No finale, no grand exit. Just one day there, the next day gone. And honestly, that is kind of fitting for a show about an angel. So if you blinked, you missed it. And if you remember it at all, it is probably because you were trying to figure out what on earth it had to do with Happy Days. Turns out the answer was almost nothing. If you thought Baywatch was the weirdest thing David Hasselhoff ever did, just wait. Baywatch Nights was a spin-off that started off as a detective show and ended up as a full-blown science fiction fever dream. Yes, really. Imagine running in slow motion on the beach one day and then chasing vampires the next. That was the journey. And if that sounds like a joke, nope. It actually aired on television in the 1990s and someone somewhere gave it a green light. Twice. Here is how it started. David Hasselhoff's character, Mitch Buchanan, decided he was not busy enough saving drowning tourists in red swim trunks. So at night, he opened a private detective agency. You know, because that is what lifeguards do. He partnered with his buddy Garner Ellerby, a former cop, and they solved beach-adjacent crimes. Stolen jet skis, cheating spouses, the occasional nightclub brawl. It was cheesy, sure, but it made sense. In a Baywatch kind of way. But then came season 2. Someone in the writer's room must have said, "You know what this show needs? Monsters." And the rest just happened. Suddenly, Baywatch Nights transformed into a supernatural detective series. Mitch and company were no longer just solving crimes. They were fighting sea creatures, stopping alien abductions, investigating haunted amusement parks. It was like they mashed The X-Files and Scooby-Doo into Baywatch and hoped no one would notice. Spoiler? Everyone noticed. Fans were confused. Critics were baffled. and poor David Hasselhoff was trying to look serious while talking to ghosts. It was the kind of career moment that made you say, maybe the talking car was the peak. The tone shift was so dramatic, it felt like the show had hit its head on a surfboard and started hallucinating. Gone were the warm lifeguard vibes. In came the fog machines, the dramatic music, and way too many scenes involving flashlights and ancient scrolls. To be fair, it was the 1990s. Weird television was in. Shows like The X-Files, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Millennium were gaining traction. But those shows had a plan. Baywatch Nights felt like someone spun a wheel labeled Plot and pointed at whatever it landed on. Episode 1, Haunted Hotel. Episode 2, Werewolf in the City. Episode 3, Mitch Buchanan fights invisible creatures. It got wild. The most ironic part? Season 2 was actually supposed to save the show. Ratings had been dropping fast after Season 1, and the producers thought a shift into sci-fi might catch a new audience. Instead, it just alienated the old one and confused the rest. The series was quietly canceled after 2 seasons, and nobody talked about it much afterward. Not even Hasselhoff. Looking back, Baywatch Nights is like the fever dream you have after falling asleep with the television on. It started off normal enough, then things got weird, and by the time you wake up, you're not even sure it was real. But it was, and it aired on real network television. And it is 100% proof that even the most popular shows can spin off into complete chaos. Enos was the kind of character you just wanted to root for. He was polite, loyal, and just a little bit slow on the uptake, but in a charming way. As the bumbling deputy in The Dukes of Hazzard, Enos was basically the Mayberry cousin no one invited but everyone secretly liked. So naturally someone said, "What if we took this small-town sidekick and dropped him in Los Angeles?" That was the premise of Enos. And yes, it was exactly as chaotic as it sounds. The idea was that Enos, after helping stop a major robbery in Hazard County, gets recruited by the Los Angeles Police Department. So he packs up, says goodbye to the Duke boys and Daisy, and heads to the big city. What follows is a fish-out-of-water sitcom that tries to mix the Dukes of Hazzard's homespun charm with big city cop drama. Imagine Andy Griffith meets Chips, only with more awkwardness and less horsepower. The problem was not Enos himself. The character was sweet and likable. He just was not built to carry an entire show. In The Dukes of Hazzard, his innocence played well against all the car chases and moonshine-fueled chaos. In Enos, his wide-eyed simplicity came off more confused than endearing. He was suddenly in a world full of crime, bureaucracy, and real stakes, and the tone could not keep up. The show tried to play it both ways. One moment, Enos is chasing jewel thieves through downtown LA. The next, he is sending love letters to Daisy and getting lectured by his hard-nosed captain. You never really knew what genre it was supposed to be. Was it a comedy, a police procedural, a romance? The only constant was that Enos looked out of place in every single scene. They even tried giving him a partner, an edgy, sarcastic detective meant to balance him out. But instead of chemistry, you got contrast. The jokes felt forced. The action felt flat. And worst of all, the heart of the original Dukes was completely missing. No General Lee. No car jumps. No Uncle Jesse. Just Enos trying really hard to be relevant in a world that clearly had not planned for him. Ratings were rough. Fans of the Dukes of Hazzard tuned in at first, hoping for more of the good stuff. But what they got was a watered-down, city version of a country character who worked best with a dirt road under his boots. After 1 season, the show got the axe. Enos eventually returned to the Dukes of Hazzard, quietly slipping back into his old role like nothing happened. It was probably for the best. Some characters just do not work without their original setting. Enos needed Hazard County. He needed Roscoe and Boss Hogg and all the ridiculousness that made the show click. So, what was Enos? A noble try, a misstep, a gentle reminder that not every fan favorite needs a spotlight. Sometimes, it is better to be the lovable deputy in the background than the confused lead trying to make it in the big city. Florence Johnston was never afraid to speak her mind. As the live-in maid on the Jeffersons, she mastered the art of the comeback. One minute, she was dusting a bookshelf. The next, she was putting George Jefferson in his place, again. She was quick, witty, and never missed a beat. So naturally, someone thought, let's give this woman her own show. And thus, Checking In was born. But what should have been a slam dunk ended up lasting just 4 episodes. Not 4 seasons, 4 episodes. The premise was not bad. Florence gets a promotion and leaves the Jefferson household to become the head of housekeeping at a ritzy Manhattan hotel. Suddenly, she is running a staff, dealing with demanding guests, and navigating a brand new world full of hotel drama. The setting had potential. Think The Love Boat, but on land, with a strong, sassy lead at the center. But potential only gets you so far when the writing is this shaky. Checking In tried to take Florence's one-liners and stretch them across an entire episode. On the Jeffersons, her sarcasm was a punchy side dish, something to spice up the scene. In her own show, it became the main course. And that is when you start to realize, too much spice without the right ingredients just burns. The supporting characters were forgettable. There was the uptight hotel manager, the flustered bellboy, the awkward front desk clerk, each one more cardboard than the last. They were supposed to be the new family, but they felt more like background noise. Florence had no real foil, no George Jefferson to clash with, no Louise to ground her. It was like watching a comedian on stage with no crowd to bounce off of. And the humor? Safe. Too safe. It tiptoed around the kind of bold, edgy tone that made the Jeffersons so iconic. Florence's best moments came when she stood up to power, called out nonsense, or delivered a line so sharp it left George speechless. In Checking In, she was stuck cleaning up hotel messes, literally and figuratively, with no real spark behind the mop. But the worst part? The network barely gave it a chance. After just 4 episodes, Checking In was pulled. It was a blink and you missed it kind of cancellation. And just like that, Florence packed her bags and returned to the Jeffersons as if none of it had ever happened. It was a reset so fast you almost felt bad bringing it up again. The funny thing is, this spin-off had all the ingredients for success. Beloved character, fresh setting, built-in fan base. But it proves something important. A strong character is not enough without a strong show around them. Florence was electric, but electricity still needs a working circuit. In the end, Checking In is one of those television blips people forget even happened. And that is kind of a shame, because in the right hands, with the right writers, maybe Florence could have carried a series. But the hotel lost its reservation before it even opened the minibar. Detective Phil Fish always looked like he had just woken up from a nap he did not enjoy. He was slow-moving, tired-eyed, and constantly complaining about his hemorrhoids. But somehow, he was one of the most memorable characters on Barney Miller. Abe Vigoda's deadpan delivery made Fish a standout in a cast full of strong personalities. So when someone pitched a spin-off centered around him, the studio said, why not? But what they got was less a police comedy and more a sitcom about foster parenting? Yes, really. In Fish, Phil retires from the force and decides to become a foster parent with his wife Bernice. Gone were the holding cells and police banter. In their place, a house full of troubled kids and a lot of uncomfortable silences. The tone shifted from workplace comedy to domestic drama with sprinkles of awkward humor. It was like going from black coffee to lukewarm herbal tea. Technically still a drink, but not what you signed up for. The weirdest part was watching Fish, this curmudgeonly cop who could barely make it through a shift without sitting down, try to wrangle teenagers. He had zero energy and even less patience. And while that might sound funny on paper, it mostly came across as sad. Bernice, played by Florence Stanley, had more warmth and drive, but even she could not carry scenes that felt more like after-school specials than sitcom moments. The show tried to mix life lessons with laughs, but it struggled with the balance. One minute a kid is running away from home, the next Fish is making a joke about prune juice. It was never clear if you were supposed to laugh, cry, or change the channel. A lot of viewers picked that last option. The foster kids themselves were fine. Each had their own personality, their own thing. But none of them had the kind of chemistry that makes a sitcom family feel real. They were just orbiting around Fish, who mostly looked like he was trying to figure out what day it was. You could practically hear the creaking of the floorboards every time he shuffled across the living room. And let's be honest, Fish worked best in the background. On Barney Miller, his tired sarcasm was a perfect counterbalance to the chaos of the precinct. He delivered his lines with the kind of slow, deliberate rhythm that made you lean in. On his own show, that same rhythm felt like watching paint dry. And not the quick-drying kind. Fish lasted for 2 seasons, but barely. Ratings dropped steadily, and by the end, even the most loyal Barney Miller fans had tuned out. The character returned for a few guest appearances later on, but the spin-off never really came up again, almost like the network wanted to forget it too. In hindsight, Fish was a noble swing at something deeper. It tried to be heartfelt, tried to show a different side of a beloved character. But sometimes, when you take the slowest guy in the room and ask him to lead the charge, you end up moving backward. You know those characters who make you laugh just by showing up? That was Grady. With his oversized glasses, shuffling walk, and constant confusion, he was the lovable neighbor from Sanford and Son who always seemed one step behind, but somehow still made it to the punchline. Played by Whitman Mayo, Grady was that perfect mix of dazed and delightful. So when the showrunners gave him his own spin-off, fans figured they were in for more of that offbeat magic. But instead of gold, what they got was mostly static. Grady picked up with the character moving out of Watts and into the suburbs to live with his daughter and her family. Right away, that premise sounds like a sitcom setup from a screenwriting class. What happens when a confused old man crashes a modern household? It had fish out of water written all over it. The problem was it forgot to bring the water, or the fish. In Sanford and Son, Grady worked because he was a side dish. Fred Sanford would throw a barb, and Grady would mishear it or misunderstand it in hilarious fashion. The jokes landed because of contrast. Fred was fast-talking and sharp, while Grady wandered through every sentence like he forgot where it started. But take away Fred, Lamont, and the junkyard, and suddenly Grady's dazed delivery had nowhere to go. The suburban setting did not help. The new cast felt generic, like they had been pulled from a sitcom starter pack. You had the well-meaning daughter, the skeptical son-in-law, and a grandchild thrown in for good measure. None of them had the charisma or chemistry that Grady had with the original cast, so instead of bouncing off each other, they just kind of stood there, waiting for Grady to carry every scene. And that is where the trouble really started. Because as funny as Grady was, he was never built to lead. His whole shtick was about reacting, not driving the plot. But now, he had to be the center of every joke, every setup, every bit of conflict, and the writers leaned way too hard into the "old man is confused again" routine. There are only so many times you can misplace your glasses before it stops being funny and starts being exhausting. The laugh track did its best. It really did. But even it sounded tired by episode 4. The show tried to anchor Grady's charm in family values. A lot of episodes revolved around learning lessons, bonding with the grandson, or dealing with neighborhood drama. But none of it stuck. It felt like a knockoff version of shows that were already doing it better. And the one thing Sanford and Son always had, edge, was completely missing here. Grady played it safe. Too safe. Ratings started low and never really recovered. Only 10 episodes were aired before the plug was pulled. A couple more were filmed but never saw the light of day. It was a quiet ending to a show that never made much noise to begin with. Grady eventually returned to Sanford and Son, and all was forgiven. Kind of like when a friend goes off to try something new, fails miserably, and comes back like nothing ever happened. And honestly, that was probably for the best. Grady was never meant to be the lead actor. He was the scene stealer. And when you put the spotlight on a guy who works best in the shadows, you end up squinting. When MASH ended in 1983, it left behind one of the biggest legacies in television history. The final episode pulled in over 100 million viewers, a cultural moment so massive it practically demanded a follow-up. And that is exactly what the creators tried to do with Aftermash. They brought back Colonel Potter, Klinger, and Father Mulcahy. The idea was simple. The war is over, but life goes on. What happens when these beloved characters try to adjust to civilian life? Turns out, what happens is mostly confusion, disappointment, and a lot of head-scratching. Aftermash took place at a stateside veterans hospital called General Pershing Weissive. Potter was now chief of staff, Klinger worked as his assistant, and Father Mulcahy was dealing with a crisis of faith. So far, so good. The pieces were in place. The setting made sense. And the cast, at least part of it, had the same charm that made MASH work. But there was one huge problem. This was not the battlefield anymore. It was paperwork, pensions, and post-war bureaucracy. And it was just not funny. The original MASH thrived on tension. War, death, and absurdity lived side by side, and the show danced that line with grace. Aftermash tried to apply the same formula to hospital life, but the stakes were too different. Gone was the chaos of the battlefield. Instead, we got scenes of doctors filling out forms, arguing about policy, and dealing with mild administrative conflict. There were moments of humor, sure, but they were thin, like trying to stretch a blanket over a bed that is clearly too big. Klinger, played by Jamie Farr, was still wearing weird outfits and scheming. Only now, instead of trying to get out of the army, he was trying to help patients. And it just felt wrong. The desperation was gone. The spark was dimmed. Even Father Mulcahy, once a spiritual anchor with a quiet intensity, now looked lost most of the time, wandering around hallways and muttering about purpose. To be fair, the show was not trying to be bad. If anything, it was too earnest. It wanted to honor veterans, highlight the difficulties of post-war life, and treat the subject with care. But in trying to be important, it forgot to be entertaining. It was like watching a lecture dressed up as a sitcom. The writing leaned heavy into messages, light on punchlines. The heart was there, but the soul of MASH was missing. Viewers gave it a shot, at least at first. The premiere had strong numbers. People missed the old gang. But as the weeks went on, the drop-off was steep. Critics were unimpressed, and fans of MASH slowly realized that lightning does not strike twice. Aftermash was canceled during its second season, and to this day, it is mostly remembered as a cautionary tale. How do you follow a legend? Maybe you just don't. Looking back, Aftermash is like that reunion tour no one asked for. You love the band, but the music does not hit the same. The war was over, but the war stories were what made MASH great. Without them, you were just watching paperwork. He could vanish with the push of a button. Gemini Man was a science fiction action show with a simple hook. A secret agent gains the ability to become invisible for short bursts of time. It was fast, sleek, and full of potential. But it never clicked. The lead, Ben Murphy, played Agent Sam Casey, a motorcycle-riding, beach-loving secret operative with a wristwatch that turned him transparent. The effects for their time were impressive. The idea had bite, but the scripts did not. Each episode followed the same basic arc. Invisible Man solves the case, reappears in time to deliver a wisecrack, and rides off into the sunset. There was little depth, no character growth, and the concept, while flashy, wore thin quickly. NBC launched the show with fanfare, but audiences were not impressed. The mid-70s were filled with science fiction experiments, and Gemini Man got lost in the noise. Ratings dipped. Critics shrugged, and after 11 episodes, it disappeared just like its protagonist. A few episodes were later re-edited into a television movie, but the series never returned. Invisibility, it turns out, is not much of a superpower when it comes to storytelling. Gemini Man was slick, but shallow. It promised adventure and gave us repetition. Today, it is remembered mostly by collectors and curious fans of retro sci-fi. A show that had all the right gadgets, but none of the spark. Another forgotten ghost of the broadcast era, flickering in and out of memory. The 20th Century Fox Hour was a short-lived attempt to bridge the golden age of cinema with the golden glow of television. Running from 1955 to 1957, it was an anthology series that adapted well-known films and original stories into hour-long television dramas. It was elegant, it was cinematic, It tried to carry the weight of the studio's name on its back and bring it straight into your living room. Each episode had a familiar polish to it, like watching a condensed movie but with all the grandeur still intact. Famous stories were trimmed down to fit into 60 minutes, and new dramas tried their best to live up to the brand that preceded them. Some succeeded, some did not. But even when it missed with grace. The lighting, the music, the framing, it all felt like a miniature film festival delivered to your living room. You did not watch it to laugh or relax, you watched it to watch. It reminded people that television could be art, not just noise. But every Sunday, viewers knew they were getting something a little more refined, a little more serious. In a world of variety shows and slapstick, the 20th Century Fox Hour felt like a whisper from the movie theater down the street. It was classy without being cold, dramatic without being dull. But the formula proved hard to sustain. The rise of sitcoms, westerns, and science fiction made its slower pacing feel out of step. Eventually, it quietly faded, unable to compete with the flashier new kids on the block. But it left behind a strange elegance, a kind of dignity that other shows rarely aimed for. Some shows are just too weird and wonderful to survive. The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. was one of them. Imagine a show that mixed cowboy shootouts with futuristic science fiction, where a Harvard-educated bounty hunter rode horseback through the Wild West, chasing outlaws and ancient alien technology. It should not have worked, but somehow it did. Bruce Campbell's Brisco was charming, sharp, and oddly philosophical for a man in spurs. The tone was part Western, part comic book, and part pulp serial, and all heart. It winked at the camera, but never lost its soul. There were glowing orbs, steampunk gadgets, and a subplot about time-traveling artifacts that felt wildly out of place, and yet completely right. It was not just about justice. It was about belief. Belief in progress, in legacy, in the idea that even the Wild West had a future worth dreaming of. But television did not know what to do with it. The ratings were decent. The fan base was devoted, but it was too different, too out there. After one season, it was gone. One of the most original shows of the 1990s disappeared into the void while the world chose safer stories. Now, it lives on in whispers, on fan forums, in dusty DVD collections, in the memories of those who knew television had stumbled upon something special and let it slip away. Brisco County was ahead of its time. Maybe that was the problem. Or maybe the real adventure was just getting to see it at all. It was a sitcom with bark, but no bite. McGurk. A Dog's Life featured actors in full-body dog costumes, playing a family of suburban canines navigating everyday problems like job interviews, neighborhood feuds, and raising puppies. Yes, really. It sounds like a bizarre fever dream, and watching it felt even stranger. The actors, muffled by their rubber dog heads, delivered dialogue through stiff movements and awkward lip-syncing. The humor relied on canine puns and human situations made weirder by the fact that everyone was dressed like a golden retriever. The show's premise was never fully explained. Were these dogs living in a world of humans? Were they symbolic? Satirical? No one knew, and that uncertainty made it nearly impossible for viewers to connect. Audiences were bewildered, critics were harsh, even kids, who were assumed to be the target audience, seemed more confused than entertained. NBC hoped it would be a quirky, family-friendly hit, but McGurk stumbled out of the gate. The novelty wore off fast. Once you got past the initial shock of talking dogs in business suits, there was not much left. No sharp writing, no emotional core, just a lot of wagging tails and sitcom tropes buried in fur. The show lasted only a handful of episodes before being quietly retired. Few mourned its passing. But in its own strange way, McGurk has become a cult legend. Proof that in the 1970s, networks were willing to try anything, even a dog-suit sitcom. Today, it stands as one of the oddest experiments to ever grace prime time. A surreal reminder that television's strangest ideas sometimes make it all the way to air. Super Train was a show that promised the future and delivered a train wreck. Literally. Picture this: A massive nuclear-powered train that had everything from gyms to swimming pools to full-blown nightclubs, speeding across America like a landlocked spaceship. It was NBC's answer to The Love Boat, except instead of a cruise, you were on rails. And instead of smooth sailing, it was a multi-million-dollar gamble that crashed and burned faster than anyone expected. The production budget was astronomical for its time, higher than anything else on television in 1979. They even built a giant set and miniature models for the train itself. But viewers, they just didn't show up. The stories on board were supposed to be romantic and dramatic and weekly anthologies, but the scripts were flat and the characters forgettable. It aired on Sunday nights, and NBC had high hopes that it would become the next big thing. Instead, Super Train became the poster child for overambition. Critics tore it apart, and within a few months, it was gone. Still, for a show that failed so spectacularly, it left behind something rare. Footage that looks like retrofuturism exploded all over your screen. It's wild, lavish sets, bright lights, an entire casino inside a train. You cannot look away. It's hard not to respect just how bold it was, even if it collapsed under its own weight. Super Train was flashy, short-lived, and unforgettable for all the wrong, and maybe just a few right, reasons. There was something strange and beautiful about this show, like a bedtime story wrapped in a sitcom. Nanny and the Professor was about a mysterious English nanny named Phoebe Figalili, who arrived out of nowhere to care for the chaotic household of Professor Everett and his 3 kids. She had an air of magic about her, never overt, never explained, but always understood. This was not a flashy show. There were no laugh tracks forcing you to find it funny, no obvious special effects screaming for attention. Instead, it asked you to believe, to trust that sometimes the people who save us do not come with explanations. They just show up quietly, like Nanny did, and make life a little better without asking for anything in return. There were whispers that she was psychic. Some thought she was a witch, but it never mattered. What mattered was that she taught 3 kids and a tired, widowed professor how to feel joy again. And for a brief moment in television history, that kind of emotional rescue was enough. When the show ended after just 2 seasons, it left behind a strange sense of unresolved wonder. We never found out who Nanny really was. Maybe that was the point. Some people are not meant to stay. They just pass through when you need them most. Like a childhood memory you can almost remember, but not quite. Sometimes even the most absurd ideas make it to air. Holmes and Yo-Yo was one of those shows, a buddy cop sitcom with a twist. The twist being that one of the detectives was a robot. Not just any robot, but one who constantly malfunctioned in ridiculous ways. He printed arrest reports from his chest. He beeped when nervous. He got magnetized at crime scenes and once even had a phone ring inside his stomach. It was meant to be charming, quirky, maybe even futuristic. But what viewers got was a surreal nightmare in sitcom form. The jokes were so forced they felt like they had been written by a machine, too. There was no rhythm, no warmth, and no real chemistry between the human and the android. Critics called it embarrassing. Audiences were baffled. And while children might have giggled at the silly gadgets, most adults changed the channel in quiet disbelief. Behind the scenes, there was desperation. The creators tried to patch things up, sharpen the humor, humanize the robot. But it was too late. The show aired just 13 episodes before it was pulled from the schedule. It left behind almost no cultural footprint. It is hard to believe it existed at all, but that is what makes it unforgettable in all the wrong ways. In a sea of over-the-top teen dramas and goofy comedies, the mystery files of Shelby Woo stood out by being both grounded and bold. Shelby Woo was not a pop star or a secret princess. She was just a smart, curious teenager with a badge-shaped dream and a knack for uncovering the truth. Set in a sleepy Florida town, the show followed Shelby as she interned at the local police department while juggling school, friendships, and all the usual teenage trials. But Shelby's world was not just locker notes and after-school crushes. It was suspects, clues, and dead ends. She was relentless, observant, brave, and most importantly, she listened. It was not just about solving mysteries. It was about learning who you are when no one else sees you clearly. Shelby's quiet tenacity made her a role model for kids who felt underestimated, unseen, or overlooked. Where other shows gave us caricatures of teens, Shelby Woo gave us someone who felt real. Not perfect, not invincible, just determined. The show had a quiet confidence to it. It did not rely on special effects or trendy lingo. It let the stories carry the weight. It gave kids the benefit of the doubt that they could handle mystery, complexity, and moral ambiguity, that maybe they wanted more than just punchlines. Shelby broke the mold not by being loud, but by being thoughtful. She was proof that curiosity could be cool, that asking questions could be power. The series slowly faded from the spotlight as flashier content took over, but it left behind something rare, a girl detective who did not need to be superhuman to be unforgettable. Cop Rock may be one of the strangest experiments ever aired on network television. Premiering in 1990, it was an audacious fusion of gritty police drama and full-blown Broadway musical. Imagine officers discussing a brutal arrest and then breaking into a choreographed song about the criminal justice system. That was the show. It was created by Stephen Bocco, the mind behind acclaimed dramas like Hill Street Blues and NYPD Blue. And maybe that was the problem. Audiences expected hard-hitting realism, not musical numbers performed in a courtroom. The shift was jarring. Each week, viewers were asked to suspend belief not just for a case, but for a genre. 1 minute, a detective was interrogating a suspect, and the next, a gospel choir was singing about corruption. It wasn't satire, it wasn't camp, it was earnest, and that confused people even more. The show wasn't trying to be funny, it was trying to be groundbreaking. The songs were sometimes moving, often bizarre, and always unexpected. Critics did not know what to make of it. Some called it brave, others called it a disaster. Most just stared, baffled. Ratings tanked. After 11 episodes, it was gone. But in that brief, bewildering season, something bold happened. Cop Rock tried to do what no show had done before, or has done since. It blurred the lines between storytelling and spectacle, and it refused to apologize for it. Today, it's often mocked, sometimes defended, but rarely forgotten by those who saw it. It was television taking a huge swing, and sure, it missed. But it swung. And in a world of safe formulas and endless reboots, that matters. What starts as a romantic gesture ends up as one of the strangest sitcoms ever aired on American television. The Ugliest Girl in Town followed an American man who, in a desperate attempt to stay close to a British woman he loved, disguised himself as a female fashion model and found unexpected success in London. That is the premise. And yes, it really aired in prime time. The show leaned heavily into slapstick humor and gender-bending gags that were already outdated before the first episode premiered. Audiences were confused. Critics were baffled. The series tried to be progressive, maybe even charming, but it landed squarely in the uncanny valley of cringe. The makeup and wigs were absurd, the character motivations paper-thin, and the tone all over the place. It neither respected nor understood the complexities of the themes it was playing with. And yet, ABC gave it 17 episodes, each one a surreal journey into a world where a man in a dress could somehow pass for a top model without anyone catching on. Viewers did not buy it. The laughs were forced, the cultural pushback quiet but firm. It was not offensive in the way some shows are, it was just tone-deaf. Oddly cheerful about a premise that probably should have stayed a sketch instead of a series. Over time, it became a punchline in retrospectives about misguided television decisions. It is rarely re-aired, and for good reason. Some shows are forgotten because they were ahead of their time. This one was forgotten because even in its own time, it felt completely out of place. The Bigelow Theater was one of those brief glimmers in television history that seemed to burn too brightly and too fast. Airing from 1950 to 1951, it lived a strange dual life, first as a CBS anthology drama and later repackaged for Dumont under various names. At its core, it was a stage for stories, real ones, deep ones, sometimes even a little too ambitious for their times. Each episode was a self-contained play, complete with rising tension and dramatic conclusions that tried to stretch the television format beyond its early limits. But here's what sets it apart: the talent it attracted. A young James Dean appeared on it before he became legend. George C. Scott showed up long before anyone called him iconic. For one brief, shining moment, the Bigelow Theater was a springboard for greatness. It was the kind of show that didn't just cast actors, it captured them at the edge of becoming icons. There was a rawness in the performances, a feeling that no one quite knew they were making history. Every episode felt like a rehearsal for something much bigger, but no less sincere. And because of that, it became a quiet archive of American talent right before it exploded. But it never quite caught the public's imagination in the way its network hoped. It lacked flash. It asked its viewers to pay attention, to feel something. That was a lot to ask from a post-war America that just wanted to laugh or sing. And so it faded, quietly, almost politely, into television's attic of forgotten names. But those performances, those early, trembling moments of greatness, they remain buried in dusty kinescopes, just waiting for someone to remember. Some shows lasted long enough to become legends. Salute Your Shorts only needed one season. Set in Camp Anawana, this scrappy little series captured the chaos, laughter, and bittersweet awkwardness of summer camp better than anything before or since. It was loud, it was messy, it was perfect. Every episode was a snapshot of friendship forged in bug spray and bad cafeteria food. You had Donkey Lips, the lovable underdog; Budnick, the rule-breaking prankster with a hidden soft side; Dina, Sponge. They were not polished or pretty. They were real. Kids who wore mismatched socks, fought over bunk beds, and stayed up too late daring each other to sneak into the woods. But what made Salute Your Shorts stick was its honesty. It understood that camp is more than canoe races and ghost stories. It is where kids first learn how to be away from home, how to find your place, how to fall in and out of crushes and feel like the world is ending over a lost flashlight. It was funny, yes, but also deeply nostalgic. Even as it aired, it felt like something already gone. Maybe that is why it ended so quickly. It burned too bright. Networks wanted polish. What they got was heart. Now it survives in memory, in campfire smoke and the sound of a distant whistle, in the way the theme song still gets stuck in your head out of nowhere. For those who remember, Salute Your Shorts was more than just a show. It was a summer that never really ended. You would think that turning one of the most successful comedies of all time into a television show would be a sure thing. But Delta House proved just how quickly lightning can escape the bottle. Based on the hit movie Animal House, this series tried to translate the chaos, raunch, and rebellion of the big screen into a weekly sitcom, only now under the watchful eye of network censors. And it showed. Gone were the wild parties, the edge, and the sense of danger. What remained was a watered-down echo of what once made people howl with laughter. Some of the original cast returned, including John Vernon as the uptight Dean Wormer, but without John Belushi's magnetic presence, the show felt like a tribute act. The humor was neutered. The stories went nowhere. ABC hoped that the mere association with the movie would be enough to draw in fans, but those fans were not fooled. This was not the Animal House they remembered. Ratings started strong but fell quickly. The characters, once riotous and wild, now felt flat and safe. Within 13 episodes, the show was off the air. Critics called it forgettable. Even the network seemed eager to move on. Delta House became another example of how television sometimes strangles the very spirit it hopes to bottle. You cannot fake irreverence, and you definitely cannot sanitize rebellion. Today, it is a curiosity, remembered mostly by die-hard fans and trivia buffs, a show that tried to cash in on chaos and wound up lost in the quiet. Out of This World was the kind of show that could only exist in the 80s, a sitcom about a teenage girl who discovers on her 13th birthday that her father is an alien and she has supernatural powers. That sounds like something you'd find in the last row of a dusty VHS bargain bin, and honestly, that's the charm. This show somehow managed to blend heartwarming family moments, slapstick comedy, and intergalactic weirdness, all in one neon-washed package. It aired in syndication, which meant it never had a consistent time slot, but Sundays were a regular go-to in a lot of local markets. The lead character, Evie, had the power to freeze time by touching her index fingers together, a trick that was used so often it became one of the most recognizable gags of the show. The real kicker? Her alien dad, who you never actually saw, spoke to her through a glowing cube and was voiced by Burt Reynolds. Yes, that Burt Reynolds. It ran for 4 seasons, but because it was never a network darling and never had rerun deals, it kind of disappeared once the final episode aired. Ask anyone who remembers it and they'll light up with nostalgia, then immediately question if it was a dream. It was campy. It was bizarre. And it was something truly, uniquely 80s. Out of This World might have vanished from the spotlight, but for those who saw it, it never left their memories. This show was weird. Beautifully, unapologetically weird. The Adventures of Pete and Pete followed 2 red-headed brothers, both named Pete, through a suburban world that never quite behaved like it was supposed to. Their town had superheroes, personal nemeses, dancing tattooed moms, and ice cream men who waged psychological warfare. It was childhood stretched into surrealism. Every story felt like it came from a dream you almost forgot, but remembered just enough to know it meant something. There were bike rides that felt like quests, songs that seemed to change time, and friendships that dug deep into the soul. Little Pete was defiant and wild, a spark of rebellion. Big Pete was thoughtful and unsure, trying to figure out who he was becoming. Together, they made sense of a world that never did. The show never explained itself. That was its brilliance. It did not try to teach you a lesson, it just let you feel. Joy, confusion, sorrow, wonder. It trusted that you could handle that. And somehow, you always could. Pete and Pete vanished not because it failed, but because it did not fit the mold. Too poetic to be a kid's show, too silly to be called art. So it slipped between the cracks, like many beautiful things do. But if you ever saw an episode, really saw it, then you know it still lives somewhere deep inside your memory, right next to that weird summer day that felt like it meant more than it should have. The idea was magic. A group of travelers, scientists, teens, mystics, find themselves trapped in a mysterious dimension where time and reality break down. They search for a way home, journeying through a series of strange lands, each with its own rules, cultures, and dangers. That was The Fantastic Journey. A mix of science fiction and fantasy, it was a show that promised discovery, imagination, and adventure. But what it delivered was something far more chaotic. Despite an ambitious premise, the show was never given the time or budget it needed to build its world. Sets looked recycled. The effects were underwhelming. The writing swerved between philosophical and campy, often within the same episode. One week they were battling telepathic overlords, the next week they were navigating a land of forgotten civilizations. It felt like 3 different shows fighting for control. Characters were introduced and dropped. Storylines never paid off. Even the lead actor was changed mid-season. NBC had hoped for a ratings hit, but the show struggled to build a consistent audience. Viewers were intrigued but also confused. What was the journey, really? Where were they going? And why did it feel like the writers were just as lost as the characters? After only 10 episodes, The Fantastic Journey was canceled. But in those few hours, it captured something unique, a wild, unpolished attempt to blend science fiction with mythology and metaphysics. It did not succeed, but it did not completely fail either. For some, it still lingers as a vivid memory of what television used to try before it learned to play things safe. A weird, winding path through television's stranger corners. There are certain shows that live in the very bones of American pop culture, and The Ed Sullivan Show is one of them. It ran for over 2 decades, from 1948 to 1971, And if you watched television on a Sunday night during those years, chances are Ed Sullivan was part of your weekly rhythm. It was a variety show, yes, but calling it just that feels too small. It was where America saw the Beatles for the first time. It was where Elvis Presley became dangerous, where ventriloquists, dancers, comedians, and opera singers somehow all fit under one spotlight. Ed Sullivan himself was famously stiff, famously awkward, and somehow perfect. He introduced the country to new talent with that signature delivery, and he made Sunday night feel like an event. There was a weight to every booking, like he knew it might shape the future. You did not just see stars, you watched them become immortal. Whether it was a shaky stand-up comic or a fresh-faced rock band, Sullivan gave them the biggest stage in America. And in doing so, he gave us permission to fall in love with something new. But time is cruel, and memory is selective. The black and white glow of the Ed Sullivan Show has dimmed over the years, especially for younger generations who grew up in color. They know the names, but not the feeling. They know the clips, but not the build-up. That moment when the whole family leaned in, waiting to see who Ed had lined up next. Now, the footage lives on in compilations and documentaries, and the stage he made legendary is mostly a footnote. But for a time, it was the heartbeat of America's living rooms. If any of these spin-offs jogged a memory or made you laugh, tell us your favorite in the comments. Tap that like button like it's 1978, and subscribe so you never miss the shows and stories you forgot you remembered.